They built this city to display absolute power, and they destroyed it with fire. What remains of Persepolis today are silent stones, but once, this place breathed excess, ritual, and violence in equal measure. Tonight, let me take you there, slowly, to the heart of the Achaemenid Empire, to a city that announced itself long before it could be seen. The smell reached the caravans first, a day's journey from the city walls, carried on the hot, dry winds sweeping down from the mountain. It was a scent that defied simple description. There was the sweetness of crushed rose petals and honeyed dates. Yes, but beneath that, the heavy, coppery tang of slaughter, the earthy sweat of 10,000 laborers, and the sharp, clinging perfume of myrrh and sandalwood. Burned in such quantities, it was as if the priests were trying to smother the very sky. This was the breath of Persepolis, the throne of kings, the jewel of the Achaemenid Empire. It was not a city one approached. It was a city that announced itself, a sensory promise of impossible splendor and terrible power. At its heart, where the grand stairway carved from mountain stone ascended to the gate of all nations, waited a man who was not a king. He was a eunuch named Bagoas, and his duty was not to rule, but to remember. His scrolls were endless, his ink mixed from soot and gold dust. He recorded the empire's appetite, the offerings, the feasts, the labor, the cost. Persepolis lived not only in stone, but in numbers, lists, and excess, carefully tallied by a man whose task was simply to witness. The story of Persepolis was written in stone and later consumed by fire, yet it survived in the details Bagoas was forced to count. It began not with the first block laid by the great Darius, but with the land itself, commanded to bow. An entire plateau was leveled not by slaves, but by artisans paid in silver and wine, so their labor would be devotion, not punishment. Gray stone was quarried from the northern mountains, each block dragged by oxen from every satrapy, cedar from Lebanon, ropes from Egypt, drivers from Bactria. The cost was not measured in coin, but in forests felled, rivers diverted, and lifetimes quietly spent. And then came the people, a river of humanity that flowed up the stairways and through the gates. Bagoas, standing in his assigned niche, his stylus flying, recorded the tributes. The delegations came for Nowruz, the new year, a celebration that stretched for days, a ritual of consumption that was the empire's beating heart. From India, they brought parrots of molten emerald feathers and sacks of peppercorns that made the air sting. The Ethiopians presented giraffes, creatures so tall and unnervingly silent they seemed like walking dreams. The Babylonians rolled in carpets woven with threads of silver and lapis lazuli, so heavy they required 20 men to carry. The Greeks, their smiles tight, offered amphorae of olive oil and silver vessels, their artful simplicity looking strangely naked amidst the barbaric splendor. The Scythians brought horses, endless lines of them, their coats the color of wind and dust. Armenians presented wine, not in skins, but in casks of oak, each one pulled by a team of white mules. It was a map of the world made flesh, gem, and grain, all flowing to the center, to the foot of the King of Kings. Within the royal courtyards, the excess turned inwards, becoming a private universe of want. Bagoas, by virtue of his station, saw the inner chambers. The king's table was a legend. Peacocks were roasted not on spits, but reclothed in their own iridescent feathers after cooking, their beaks gilded. Swans floated on lakes of almond milk soup, seasoned with cinnamon from beyond the known world. A single banquet required the eggs of 1,000 quail, the livers of 500 geese fattened on figs, the honey from 10,000 hives in the Achaemenid forests. The wine was strained through cloth of gold and served in cups carved from a single ruby the size of a man's fist, a gift from a forgotten king of a now-vanished kingdom. The servants were more beautiful than the nobles of other lands, chosen for the symmetry of their faces, the grace of their hands. They moved in silent, perfumed procession, removing plates after a single taste, pouring wine that was often merely smelled and then discarded. But it was the women's quarters, the harem, that housed the most curated excess. Here, the empire's beauty was collected and stored. Wives, concubines, and daughters from every conquered people resided in apartments lined with silk and cooled by water channels running through floors of turquoise tile. Their clothes were whispers of Chinese silk and Indian muslin, weighted with embroidered gardens of pearl and sapphire. Their cosmetics were mixed daily: malachite for the eyes, crushed carmine beetles for the lips, saffron and gold dust for the skin. Their baths were filled not with simple water, but with rose water and the milk of asses, kept warm by a furnace tended day and night by mute slaves. The sound was a constant, low murmur of voices in a dozen languages, the strum of lyres, the clatter of ivory gaming pieces. It was a gilded cage where the only purpose was to be beautifully and expensively. Bagoas recorded the shipments, the bolts of cloth, the vials of scent, the rare fruits brought by fast horse from the furthest oases to satisfy a sudden craving. Yet, for all its terrifying grandeur, Persepolis was hollow. Bagoas began to see it. The thousands of soldiers of the immortal guard, their spear tips a forest of gold, stood so still they too seemed carved from the mountain. Their loyalty was bought with feasts and first pick of spoils, a binding of appetite, not heart. The priests performed the sacred rites before eternal flames, but the smoke of their offerings mixed with the smells of the kitchens and the stables, a confusion of the divine and the mundane. The king himself, Xerxes, son of Darius, was the apex of this system. He was less a man and more a living monument, weighed down by robes so heavy with gems he could scarcely move, isolated by layers of protocol, his every human need anticipated and amplified into ritual. He ate excess, drank excess, and slept surrounded by it. Bagoas once saw him, a man in his middle years, staring blankly at a performance of Lydian dancers, his eyes as glazed as those of the stone bulls outside. The city was consuming its own soul. The cracks appeared in small, expensive ways. A treasurer, fearing the king's displeasure over a minor shortfall, poisoned himself with a vintage so rare it left a purple stain on his lips that no laundress could remove. A prized elephant from the Indies, driven mad by the constant noise and strange scents, broke its golden chains and ran amok in the lower gardens, trampling a grove of ancient cypresses before being slain by 100 javelins. Its blood soaked the imported soil, and the garden was paved over with marble the next week. Whispers traveled the hallways, carried by the servants who were the city's true nervous system. They spoke of a young Macedonian king in the west, a man who slept on the ground, ate soldiers' rations, and marched with a speed that seemed unnatural. His name was Alexander. In Persepolis, his name was first a curiosity, then a joke, then a cold knot of fear in the stomach. They could not comprehend such a man. Their world was measured in weight, in volume, in splendor. How does one counter a storm with a mountain of gold? The end, when it came, was not a battle at the gates. The Persian army was broken elsewhere. Alexander marched into Persepolis as its steward, not yet its destroyer. He walked through the gate of all nations, a slight, weather-hardened figure beside the colossal stone bulls. Bagoas, from his hiding place in the archives, watched him. He saw the young king's face as he entered the treasury. The vast chambers, carved deep into the rock, were piled to the cavernous ceilings with gold and silver ingots, with coins from 100 mints, with gems loose in sacks like grain. It was the physical manifestation of centuries of tribute, the harvested wealth of the known world. Alexander's generals wept at the sight, but Alexander himself was silent. He picked up a handful of gold derricks and let them trickle through his fingers, a sound like dry rain. His expression was not of joy, but of a profound, weary understanding. This was the soul of the enemy, cold, heavy, and inert. The burning was said to be an accident, a drunken impulse during a wild feast in the palace, a retaliation for the burning of Athens years before. But Bagoas, fleeing the spreading inferno, with his most precious scrolls clutched to his chest, knew better. It was a necessary act. Persepolis could not be conquered, only repudiated. The fire began in the haram, fueled by silks and perfumed woods. It raced through the Apadana, where the cedar ceilings roared like living things. The gold on the columns melted and ran in glowing, liquid tears down the stone. The heat was so immense it cracked the very foundations, and the polished stone mirrors lining the halls of the Takara exploded. The smell that had once carried for a day's journey now filled the world, the perfume of 1,000,000 sacrifices, the reek of melting stone and incinerated history, the scent of excess finally meeting its limit. Alexander watched from a hill, and they say he ordered the fire put out after a single night, a gesture of regret. But it was too late. The city of stone, built to last for eternity, was undone not by siege engines, but by its own essence. Bagoas survived. He made his way east, a ghost from a dead world. His scrolls, stained by smoke and his own tears, told the true story, not of kings and battles, but of numbers. Jars of wine, pounds of gold, lengths of silk, headcounts of servants, days of labor, the weight of tribute. He had recorded the appetite of an empire, and in the end he wrote one final entry, not in ink, but in memory, as he watched the black smoke plume blot out the stars over the mountains. We built a mountain to touch the sun, and called it glory. But it was only a pyre, waiting for a spark. The city of excess had consumed all the fuel it had gathered over centuries in one glorious, terrible night, and left behind only ash, a cautionary tale written in cuneiform on cracked clay, waiting for the wind to scatter it.